The transport ship crawled through a gray Atlantic morning as mist clung to the water like breath on glass. May 1944. Somewhere between the nightmare of capture and an unknown future, 300 German prisoners of war huddled below deck, their world reduced to the creak of wood and the smell of salt and fear. When the fog finally thinned, the first shapes rose out of it. Tugboats, cranes, and then a copper silhouette that made the prisoners crowd the rails in silence. The Statue of Liberty. Her torch caught a weak beam of morning sun, and for a moment, nobody spoke. Then someone said it first in German, almost a prayer, almost a curse. This America Sanyon. This can't be America. Before we go further into this incredible true story, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from around the world. These stories need to be remembered, and you're part of keeping them alive. Hans Keller, 24 years old, a baker's son from a small village near Bremen, tightened his grip on the cold railing. His knuckles went white. Behind him, boots shuffled on wet deck planks. Chains clinked. Somewhere in the crowd, a man was crying. They'd been told stories during the crossing. Revenge, labor camps worse than anything the Reich had built. Humiliation, beatings. Some said American POW camps were just slaughterous with paperwork. Hans told himself the statue was a trick, a painted board erected to break their morale before the real horror began. But the city beyond it was not a painting. The skyline of New York stretched like iron teeth, biting into a pale morning sky. Buildings taller than anything Hans had seen in his life rose from the island like monuments to something he couldn't name. Tug whistles pierced the air, gulls screamed, and beneath it all, impossibly, the smell of coffee drifting from the docks. None of it fit the picture they'd been given of a nation on its knees. Armed U.S. military police waited along a pier, bristling with cargo nets and stacked wooden crates. The boxes were stamped with names Hans couldn't pronounce. Scranton, Akron, Chattanooga. City names that sounded like drum beats. The gangway thudded into place with a bang that made half the men flinch. "Keep your eyes down," Otto Brandt muttered behind him. Otto's hands shook as he spoke. He was older, maybe 30, with a scar that split his left eyebrow. They'll make an example of someone. They always do. Hans didn't answer. He was too busy watching. A Red Cross truck had backed up to the pier, and women in white caps were unloading metal urns that steamed like kettles on a winter morning. Not guards, not soldiers, women. Civilians moving freely among armed MPs like this was just another Tuesday morning in America. The first order came in a voice so clean and sharp it sliced through the whispering. "Colonna ein perfekt." German, sharp as a parade ground command. The men flinched by reflex, forming a ragged line. Boots snapped together, backs straightened. Years of training took over before conscious thought. Only when Hans looked for the source of the command did the shock fully land. The American officer, cap tilted at a precise angle, jaw shadowed with stubble, eyes like blue ice, was the one who'd barked the order. Captain Walter Green, U.S. Army, reading their ranks and unit patches as if he'd worn them himself. "Willkommen in New York," Green added, his face unsmiling. "Obey the rules and you'll be treated according to the Geneva Convention." The words struck Hans like cold water thrown in his face. Green's vowels were native, his consonants purely German. Not the broken, stumbling German of a schoolboy, but the real thing. The kind you only got from growing up with the language in your mouth. How many of these Americans spoke their language? How many had learned it specifically for this moment, to command them, to understand them, to know what they were saying when they thought no one was listening? It was the first crack in everything Hans thought he understood about this war. They were marched down the pier between rows of longshoremen, unloading crates, and MPs standing at parade rest. He kept waiting for it. The spitting, the jeers, the bottles thrown, the rage of a nation that had every right to hate them. It never came. Instead, a woman from the Red Cross, Clara Bennett, stitched in neat letters above her pocket, stepped forward with a metal tray balanced on both hands. Steam rose from the cups arranged on it. Coffee, she said, slow and careful, as if the word itself might bite if pronounced wrong. A glazed donut rode the rim of each cup like a halo. The first prisoner hesitated, looked at the guards, looked at the woman, then took the cup with trembling hands. Then another man, then another. When it reached Hans, the steam hit him full in the face, cinnamon and a sweetness so bold and unapologetic that it felt like a dare, like America itself was challenging him to believe what he was seeing. He took the cup. The coffee burned his tongue, the donut dissolved in his mouth, like a childhood memory he'd thought was lost forever. Otto took his and stared at it like it might be poisoned. Why give us this?" he whispered. Hans had no answer, but something cold and hard in his chest. Something that had been there since Normandy, since capture, since the ship began to crack. Past the warehouses, the city thumped with life. Car horns, shouts in English. Somewhere a radio poured out a swing melody Hans never heard but couldn't stop hearing. Posters on brick walls shouted about war bonds, about liberty, about victory. A world still at war but somehow untouched by the ruin Hans had left behind. An MP with a Pennsylvania accent was talking to another guard. "Train's ready in Jersey. They'll see half the country before lunch." It sounded like a joke. It wasn't. They were herded toward waiting trucks, olive green, canvas-topped engines idling. Hans climbed in. A wedge of pie, actual pie, that smelled of pecans and brown sugar and butter. And beneath it all, pressed flat against the bottom of the sack, was a folded scrap of paper. Hans almost missed it. His thumb brushed against the square edge, and he froze. Carefully, he palmed it, slipping it under his cap in one smooth motion while Otto tore into his sandwich beside him. He waited, counted to 50, made sure no MPs were watching, then slid the paper free just enough to read it. The handwriting was careful, feminine German script. "If you come through Abilene, tell Carl. Still waiting by the pecan tree. L.B." A Texas address followed, written clearly as if the writer wanted it to be found, needed it to be found. Hans stared at the note until the letters blurred. This was no accident. Someone had placed this message in his lunch sack deliberately. A civilian, an American civilian who knew German script, who knew prisoners would be on this train, who was willing to risk something. Hans didn't know what, but something to send a message to someone named Carl. A trap? A kindness? A test? He didn't show it to Otto. He didn't eat the pie. He tucked the note back under his cap and felt it there, like a hot coal against his scalp. The train plunged deeper into the country. Coal towns in Ohio gave way to rolling fields dotted with barns and silos painted with brand names. Purina, DeKalb, John Deere, that sounded like passwords to a world he'd never been allowed to enter. And then, at a small platform somewhere past Columbus, Hans saw them. Two girls, maybe 16, 17 years old. They stood on the wooden platform, holding a cardboard sign painted in thick black letters. "Welcome. Even enemies are men." The MP saw it too. Immediately, they started gathering prisoners on one side of the car, away from the windows, voices sharp with embarrassment or anger or something Hans couldn't name. But Hans had already read it. He could not unread it. Even enemies are men. Who were these people? That evening, as Indiana slit past in a sprawl of lights and barns, turning gold under a falling sun, Captain Green walked the aisle again. His boots clicked on the metal floor with military precision. He stopped at Hans's row and switched to German without preamble. "Your papers say you baked," Green said, not quite a question. Hans looked up, careful to keep his face neutral. "Yes, sir." "For how long?" "Since I was 15, sir." Green nodded slowly, like a man verifying a number he'd already known in advance. His eyes were unreadable. "We need bakers," he said simply. Then he moved on. Hans sat frozen. Otto leaned over, his face pale. What does that mean? Bakers in a prison camp? I don't know, but something was happening. Something beneath the surface. Messages in lunch sacks, girls with signs, a captain who spoke German perfectly and knew Hans's occupation before asking. It felt like pieces of a puzzle scattered across a table, and Hans was only just beginning to see the edges of the picture. The second twist arrived near midnight. The car had sunk into that uneasy quiet unique to soldiers and prisoners. Not quite sleep, not quite waking, just exhaustion with eyes open. Then from the vestibule between cars, a tune rose into the darkness, soft, almost careless. Someone was whistling. And the melody, Hans recognized it before his mind could catch up. Lily Marlene. The song forbidden by the Reich, beloved by soldiers on both sides, a melody that had crossed trenches and oceans and ideologies because it spoke to something deeper than flags. Men stiffened. Someone covered his eyes. No one dared join. Then, clipped and low, a voice spoke in German. Just one word. Brandts. Otto jerked like he'd been shocked. Keep still, the voice continued, barely louder than the train's rhythm. Orders came down at Cleveland, a transfer list, munitions plant detail outside Dallas. You're on it. Otto's breath caught in his throat. Hans's pulse hammered in his neck. Outside details. Everyone had heard the rumors. Prisoners who worked outside the wire, ate better, slept softer, learned America by its roads and weather and the rhythm of civilian life. Also rumored, not all details came back. Why tell us? Hans whispered into the dark. Not sure anyone would hear. The whistling slid away through the metal seam of the car. No answer came. By morning, the world had turned wide and impossibly blue. Texas prairie that ran to the edge of the sky without pause, without mercy, without end. Windmills turned slow as clock hands. Town names were painted on water towers. Wichita Falls, then west, then south. The letters shrinking behind them like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. Abilene floated at the edge of Hans's thoughts, like a photograph tucked into a novel. The note in his cap felt heavy as a gold coin. And the train rolled on toward a camp he couldn't imagine, toward a fate he couldn't predict, toward an America that refused to be the enemy they'd been promised. The camp gates appeared outside a town ringed with pecan trees and pickup trucks with dust on their fenders like badges of honor. The sign, stenciled in weathered wood, was almost disappointingly simple. U.S. Army Prisoner of War Facility. No skull and crossbones, no threats, just facts stamped in black paint. The truck rolled through, and Hans got his first real look at what would be home, or prison, or something in between those two words that the English language probably had a term for, but German did not. Rows of neat wooden barracks stretched across hard-packed earth, a small infirmary with a red cross painted on the roof, a mess hall that looked like it had been built by men who actually cared about right angles, and behind it all the smell, unmistakable, unbelievably comforting, of coffee and flour and the faint, steady heat of ovens working. Someone had chalked a menu on a board outside the mess hall. Breakfast, oatmeal, eggs, toast, coffee. It could have been a diner off Route 66. Otto stood beside Hans, his face slack with confusion. This is a prison camp? I don't know what this is, Hans admitted. The prisoners were assembled in the yard. Hard dirt, a flagpole with the American flag snapping in a hot wind, and Captain Green standing on a wooden platform like a man about to deliver a sermon. He addressed them first in English, then switched to German without missing a beat. You will work, Green said, his voice carrying across the assembly. You will be paid in camp currency. You will write letters home, censored, but delivered. If you attempt to escape, you will be shot.
If you follow the rules, you will be fed decently, housed adequately, and treated according to international law. His eyes tracked across faces like a metronome marking time. Some of you will be offered outside details, agriculture, mills, bakeries in town. You may refuse. If you refuse, you'll remain here on fence maintenance and latrine duty. His gaze caught Hans for a fraction of a beat, just a moment, but Hans felt it like a spotlight. We find, Green continued, his lips almost smiling, that bread calms men. The assembly was dismissed. Hans walked toward the barracks with Otto, both of them silent, both trying to process what kind of war this was turning out to be. But Hans didn't make it to the barracks. Keller? He turned. Sergeant Anderson stood in the shadow of the mess hall, clipboard under one arm, that same unreadable expression on his young face. Captain wants you to check the bakery, make sure it's something you can work with. Hans glanced at Otto, who shrugged and kept walking. Then he followed Anderson across the yard, boots crunching on gravel, past guards who barely looked at him, past other prisoners who watched with hollow eyes. The mesh hall door swung open, and Hans stepped into a world that smelled like home. Flour dust hung in slanted sunlight. Industrial ovens lined one wall, their iron doors warm to the touch. Wooden benches scarred with years of kneading, metal bowls stacked like silver drums. And behind the main counter, a woman in a white apron was sprinkling flour like snow over a wood-top bench. She looked up when Hans entered. "You're the baker?" she asked. Her accent was pure Texas. Every vowel stretched like taffy, every consonant softer than it had any right to be. Hans nodded, not trusting his English yet. Her eyes crinkled at the corners. She had a kind face, the kind that had seen hard years but hadn't let them turn mean. "Good," she said simply. "We'll get along just fine." She went back to her work, and Hans stood there, feeling like the floor had shifted under his feet.
This woman, this American woman whose country he'd been trying to destroy 6 months ago, was talking to him about bread density, like they were colleagues, like the war was something happening in another universe entirely. After breakfast, real eggs, real coffee, real butter melting into toast, Sergeant Anderson found Hans by the rear door of the mess hall. The MP looked younger in daylight. His eyes were the color of dusty glass, and there was a groove at the corner of his mouth that might have been a scar, or might have been a permanent expression of doubt. He spoke in English first. "You settling in?" "Okay." Hans understood enough to nod. Then Anderson slid into careful, deliberate German. "If you're ever on town detail," he said quietly, glancing over his shoulder like a man checking for eavesdroppers, "don't wander. Texans are friendly until you give them a reason not to be. Understand?" "Yes." Anderson rubbed his thumb along the edge of his clipboard. His next words came even softer. "If you see a pecan tree with a blue ribbon tied around the trunk," he paused. Let the words hang. "The person you're looking for meets people there, Thursdays after 3. Hans felt the note under his cap become a living thing, a creature with weight and heat and purpose. Anderson didn't wait for a reply. He walked away, and as he went, Hans heard him whistling low and almost careless the tail end of Lily Marlene, the same tune from the train. The third twist came that afternoon with a delivery. 2 trucks rolled through the gates carrying supplies for the kitchen. Sacks of flour stamped with mill names Hans couldn't pronounce. Bags of sugar that gleamed white as snow. Bricks of yeast wrapped in wax paper, cool as river stones to the touch. Hans helped unload under Milieri's supervision. She directed traffic like a general, telling men where to stack things, what went in the cool room, what could stay on the shelves. At the bottom of one flour sack, the last one Hans lifted, something felt wrong, too heavy, unbalanced. He glanced around. Millie was talking to another guard. Nobody was watching. Hans reached into the sack and felt fabric, oilcloth wrapped around something thin and rectangular, a packet sealed with string. He pulled it free just enough to see the address written in small, precise letters. LB. The same script, the same confidence, the same handwriting from the lunch sack note. His heart hammered against his ribs. Hans slid the packet under the flour bin with the heel of his hand, tamping it down like dough. His movements casual, practiced, the instinct of a man who'd learned to hide things under far more dangerous circumstances. "You all right, son?" Millie called from across the room. "Yes, ma'am," Hans said, the English feeling clumsy in his mouth. "Just heavy," she smiled. "That's why you got muscles, hun." That evening, the camp loudspeaker crackled to life like the voice of God filtered through rust and static. Names were read, assignments called out, fence work, kitchen duty, infirmary sweeping, laundry, the mundane machinery of imprisonment wrapped in polite American efficiency. Then a final list. The following men report for outside detail. Abilene Bakery Company. 0600 hours. Hans's pulse stopped. Keller Hans. The yard went quiet enough to hear the wind move through the pecan trees beyond the fence. Brandt Otto. Otto, standing 10 feet away, stared at Hans like he'd been betrayed, like Hans had arranged this somehow, his face drained of color. Hans wasn't sure which feeling hit him first, fear, luck, or the sharp, cold knowledge that someone, somewhere had stacked this deck deliberately. When the lights snapped off and the barracks sank into darkness, the only sounds were anxious breathing and the creak of wood settling. Somewhere, a man prayed and whispered German. Somewhere else, another man wept silently into his pillow. Hans lay on his back, eyes open to the dark, staring at wooden slats he couldn't see. He thought of the statue in the fog, the girls with their cardboard sign. The way Captain Green had said Baker, like a man reading a card only he was allowed to see. He thought of pecan trees and blue ribbons and a packet under the flour bin sealed with string and tied to a stranger's initials. He thought of messages hidden in lunch sacks and tunes whistled in the dark, and a country that refused to be the enemy he'd been trained to hate. "This can't be America," Otto whispered from the bunk above, but there was no mockery in his voice now, only wonder and a terrible rising hope that felt more dangerous than any bullet Hans had ever dodged. Before dawn, boots thumped down the aisle like a drumbeat, pulling men from whatever dreams prisoners were allowed to have. A door opened to Texas blue, sky so wide and clean it hurt to look at. A truck idled by the gate, engine coughing diesel smoke into the cool morning. Sergeant Anderson stood beside it, clipboard in hand, counting heads as men climbed into the back. Hans tucked the note inside his shirt, felt the paper heat against his skin like a secret with a pulse. Otto climbed in beside him, silent, his face gray with exhaustion or fear or both. Around them, 6 other prisoners, men whose names Hans didn't know, sat with backs against the truck rails watching the camp shrink behind them as they rolled toward town, toward Abilene, toward a bakery that might only be a bakery, toward a tree that might only be a tree, toward a message that might be the first line in a story no one on either side of the wire was supposed to tell. The town appeared slowly. First scattered houses, then a main street with stores that sold hardware and dresses and things people bought when they weren't afraid the world was ending. A movie theater with a marquee advertising a film Hans had never heard of. A diner with windows that glowed yellow warm even in daylight. The bakery sat on a corner, brick and wood, with a painted sign that said simply Abilene Bakery Co. since 1889. Just for a second. Just long enough, she smiled. Not a big smile, just a small curve at the corner of her mouth that said, "I see you." Then she was gone. Hans's hands kept kneading dough, but his mind had stopped working entirely. At lunch, Anderson brought sandwiches in brown bags again. The prisoners ate in the back alley, sitting on crates, sun beating down on their heads. "There's a tree," Hans said quietly in German, not looking at Otto. "Behind the bakery, past the loading dock." Otto stopped chewing. "What?" "A pecan tree." So Hans didn't answer. He stood, brushed crumbs off his pants, and walked toward the corner of the building like a man stretching his legs. Anderson watched but didn't move. Hans rounded the corner. And there it was, a pecan tree. Old and thick-trunked, its branches spreading like open hands toward the sky. And tied around the trunk, fluttering in the hot Texas wind, was a ribbon. Blue, faded, but unmistakable. Hans's breath caught. He didn't approach, didn't touch it, just stood there staring at proof that the note was real, that LB was real, that whatever impossible thing was happening here was bigger than lunch sacks and whistled tunes and packets hidden in flour. Beautiful tree, isn't it? Hans spun. The woman in the blue dress stood 10 feet away holding her loaf of bread wrapped in paper. Up close, he could see her eyes were gray, her face lined with sun and time, but not unkind. I'm sorry, Hans stammered in broken English. I was just looking, she finished for him. Her German was flawless. I know. Hans froze. She stepped closer, voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. My name is Liesel Bachmann. I was born in Heidelberg. I came here in 1923. She glanced over her shoulder, then back at Hans. Karl was my brother. He was captured in North Africa. They told me he was sent to a camp in New Mexico. That was 8 months ago. I haven't heard from him since. Hans felt the note burning against his chest. The Red Cross won't tell me anything, Liesel continued, her voice tight with controlled emotion. The army won't tell me anything, so I send messages in bread bags, in supply shipments, anywhere I can, hoping anyone will see him, will tell him I'm still here, still waiting. She pressed something into Hans's hand, another note, another address, another desperate thread thrown into the dark. If you hear anything, she whispered, please. Then she turned and walked away, her blue dress disappearing around the corner, leaving Hans standing alone beneath a tree that was no longer just a tree. That evening, back at the camp, Hans lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling while Otto snored above him. He thought about Liesel Bachmann and her brother Karl, about messages hidden in flour sacks and blue ribbons tied to trees, about a network of desperate people, American and German both, trying to reach across an ocean of war to say, I remember you. You are not forgotten. He thought about Captain Green, who spoke German like a native, about Sergeant Anderson, who whistled forbidden songs and gave cryptic directions, about a country that fed its enemies donuts and paid them to bake bread and let them see girls with signs that said, even enemies are men. And he thought about the statue in the harbor with her torch raised high, not as a trick, not as propaganda, but as a promise that maybe, just maybe, some things were bigger than the uniforms men wore, or the flags they'd been told to die for. Hans pulled the note from under his shirt and read it one more time in the dim light. Still waiting by the pecan tree. He folded it carefully, tucked it back against his chest, and made a decision that would ripple through the rest of his life. Tomorrow he would find a way to send a message back, to tell Karl, wherever he was, that his sister still waited, still hoped, still believed that even in the middle of war, love could find a way through the cracks. Because if America had taught Hans Keller anything in these strange, impossible days, it was this. The enemy wasn't always who they told you it was, and sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was hope. Hans Keller worked at that bakery in Abilene for 14 months. He sent messages, he baked bread, and when the war ended, he made a choice that surprised everyone who knew his story. He stayed, not in the camp, not as a prisoner, but as a free man who'd seen enough of America to know that whatever home had been, this could be home too. He never found Karl Bachmann. Some stories don't have that kind of ending, but he stayed in touch with Liesel until she died in 1983, and every Thursday for 40 years he left a loaf of bread beneath that pecan tree, a tradition the town still keeps alive today, even though most people have forgotten why. This is the story they don't teach you, the one that doesn't fit neatly into heroes and villains, the one that reminds us that even in the worst moments of human history, people found ways to stay human. If this story reminded you that history is more complex, more beautiful, and more heartbreaking than we usually admit, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Tell me if your family has stories like this. Tell me what we've forgotten that deserves to be remembered.
Because at WW2 Soldiers Archive, we don't just tell war stories. We tell human stories that happen to take place during war, and those are the ones that matter most. Thank you for watching, thank you for caring, and I'll see you in the next story.